Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about Democrats and Republicans rallying at the Illinois State Fair under sunny skies, but with the cloud of corruption from the ongoing prosecution of what federal prosecutors called Madigan Enterprise. I'll then join the Center Square's Brett Rowland to further discuss the news. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here are the top stories from the past week. With the ongoing corruption trial of what prosecutors called Madigan Enterprise, statewide elected Democrats say that there are lessons to learn from their former leader facing federal charges. Illinois Secretary of State Alexi Giannoulias said former House Speaker Michael Madigan was never a fan of his and did everything he could to make sure he didn't get into the Secretary of State's office. Giannoulias said people are sick and tired of scandal and corruption.
So anything we can do to increase transparency and let people know exactly what happens at every level is important. We're doing that on our side with lobbyist registration. We want to do everything we can to increase transparency from the Secretary of State's vantage point.
Illinois Comptroller Susana Mendoza said the message from the Madigan saga is that nobody is above the law.
Even though sometimes it feels like maybe accountability doesn't happen or it takes too long, that eventually it catches up to people.
Madigan faces trial next year on 22 corruption counts. He's pleaded not guilty. His former chief of staff, Tim Mapes, is on trial this week. 4 others associated with Madigan were found guilty in a bribery scheme earlier this year. Recent polling shows former President Donald Trump and President Joe Biden are virtually tied. Illinois politicians shared their thoughts on the candidates. Illinois Democratic U.S. Senator Dick Durbin stood by Biden despite House Republicans aiming to possibly open an impeachment inquiry into allegations the president took part in a bribery scheme with his son Hunter Biden.
The Democrats are interested in investing, and the Republicans are interested in investigating. I think when it gets right down to it, we know what they're doing. They're trying to create a diversion as to what's happening to former President Trump.
Peoria Republican U.S. Representative Darren LaHood didn't endorse any GOP candidate, but criticized Democrats for politicizing 4 separate indictments against Trump.
As a former federal prosecutor, I believe in the rule of law, but I don't believe in the unequal application of the law. And that's what I think is happening.
The Center Square Voters' Voices poll, in conjunction with Noble Predictive Insights, shows if the two are to face off again, Trump has 41% support, with Biden at 44%, and 15% remain unsure. Those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square's Brett Rowland. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Between the Consumer Price Index, inflation, and job reports, it feels like you need a PhD in economics to fully understand the economic news happening around us every day. That's why you need the Everyday Economics Podcast. Join host Chris Krug and economist Dr. Orphe Devungi as they help you understand the economic world happening around you every day. Listen to the Everyday Economics Podcast at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcast.
Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Brett Rowland, investigative reporter for the Center Square, filling in for executive editor Dan McCaleb, who is traveling this week. Joining me today is Greg Bishop, associate Illinois editor and senior Capitol Bureau reporter. Greg, how many corn dogs have you eaten?
Well, yes, Brett, the Illinois State Fair in full swing this past week. And I want to say so far I've probably had 4 or 5 corn dogs. But you begin to lose count after about 3 or 4. So I can't answer that question. But I will say I enjoy both ketchup and mustard on my corn dog, which apparently is a pretty controversial thing around these parts.
That's a good point. We are recording this on Thursday, August 17th, and the number is 4 or 5. We'll see if that number increases later. Greg, let's talk about the state fair since you've been there most of the day. Yesterday was Democrats' Day. Tell us about that. What happened?
Yeah, so Wednesday was Governor's Day, which de facto is Democrats' Day. And you had the party faithful show up to a brunch in the early part of the day, and that was off-site, but then they gathered at the state fairgrounds for their annual Democrat rally, and the messaging was pretty heavy against Republicans. You had all of the constitutional officers, except a few, get up on a stage and give short speeches about their positions on issues from abortion to what they allege Republicans want to do and ban books, and a lot of messaging heavy on Donald Trump and characterizing Republicans as Trump apologists, as conspiracy theorists, as MAGA extremists. So they were pretty heavy-handed when it came to the rhetoric they were using against Republicans during Governor's Day, both on and off the state fairgrounds. But one thing they didn't mention was corruption. So while it was a sunny day in Springfield for Democrats' Day at the Illinois State Fair, they still had that cloud of corruption hanging over from the ongoing prosecution of what federal prosecutors call Madigan Enterprise. And for people who haven't been tracking that, you have the ComEd 4 that were found guilty earlier this year, and that's a trial that lasted several weeks. Brett, you covered it practically every day, and you know how that played out. But you had a former ComEd lobbyist, former ComEd executive, and a couple of other individuals, including a close confidant of Speaker Madigan. Speaker Michael Madigan, the longest-serving House Speaker in State House history, and also a leader of the Democratic Party of Illinois since 1998 to 2021 when he stepped down from that post. But shortly after he stepped down, he was hit with 22 counts of corruption, and he faces trial next year. But earlier this year, the ComEd 4 were found guilty. Going on this week, the former Illinois House Clerk and Madigan Chief of Staff faces a jury trial where even more evidence has been presented and audio of undercover recordings and prosecutors saying that Tim Mapes, the former House clerk, close confidant of Mike Madigan, lied to prosecutors in their investigation. So while Democrats were rallying, talking about their successes in banning certain types of firearms or strengthening access to abortion in Illinois, there wasn't any mention about corruption or ethics reforms until, of course, the media asked. And several of the Democrats I asked about the cloud of corruption of Mike Madigan said that there are already laws on the books that these individuals associated with Madigan and Madigan himself have been charged with. We've already seen some guilty verdicts. We've got the Tim Mapes trial going on this week and Madigan facing trial next year. But when it came down to it, in pushing some of the Democratic leaders, one in particular, Illinois Secretary of State Alexei Janulius, he said that Madigan was never a fan of his and that Madigan actually tried to stop Janulius from getting into the Secretary of State's office. But I asked what kind of lessons Democrats should take away from the ongoing prosecution of Madigan Enterprise. And Janulius clearly said that the people are sick and tired of scandal and corruption, and there needs to be transparency across the board, and people really need to be honest and forthright. When I talked with Comptroller Susana Mendoza about the cloud of Madigan corruption, she said the message is that no matter who you are, your bad acts likely will come back and get you. But there's, again, been really no strong efforts to shore up the ethics at the State House. And in particular, you've got the Illinois House Republican Organization. It's the political arm for the House Republicans. And they put out a statement this week saying that under new House Speaker Emanuel Chris Welch, the same Madigan rules have been applied, which the Illinois House Republican Organization says that is to curry favor for the special interests and to disregard the minority Republicans and the proposals that they have. So obviously, Governor's Day, heavy on rhetoric against Republicans, but very light on corruption, despite their former leader, House Speaker Michael Madigan, facing 22 corruption counts on what prosecutors allege was a nearly decade-long bribery scheme. But that's just Governor's Day, Brett. We had Republican Day today.
And how is that going so far, Greg? What can you tell us from Republican Day?
So it's interesting to kind of see the difference between the two parties because, as I mentioned, the Democrats filled a convention center off-site for their brunch in the morning, and they gave, good lengthy speeches. But then they came out to the fairgrounds and the handful of Democratic leaders from Speaker Welch to the governor and the comptroller and the Secretary of State and Senator Durbin, they only gave about a 10, 15-minute speech at the fairgrounds while people were eating lunch and enjoying some beverages. The House, the Republicans, they came out and rallied for a good hour and a half with speeches that were much longer than what the Democrats provided on the fairgrounds the day before. And really, the rhetoric got turned up because of the rhetoric the Democrats used. Now, one thing that Governor Pritzker said yesterday in front of Democrats, or rather Wednesday, in front of Democrats, was that Republicans are trying to say Democrats are far, far left and out of touch. But he used an expletive term that is similar to cow feces, and he said that Illinois Democrats don't put up with that. Well, House Minority Leader Tony McCombie said while Democrats claim to not put up with horse manure, she said they do put up with corruption. So you could tell that the Republicans changed the level of their rhetoric after hearing what the Democrats had to say, blasted Mike Madigan, blasted the lack of ethics reforms, went after what they said were far left radical policies, went after the heavy spending, and said that Illinois Republicans need to come together and head into 2024 united and ready to gain seats. Will that happen? Will the funding be there? These are all unanswered questions as we have a full year and some months before the November 2024 election. But Republicans right now continue to be in the super minority. And we'll see, what kind of messaging they have moving forward in the year ahead before we get to that November 2024 election. One thing also was pretty clear was the difference between Democrats and Republicans and who's going to be the Republican nominee for president and whether Joe Biden is going to maintain his position as president-elect heading into whatever happens in 2024. Democrats, all that we asked, doubled down on their support for Biden and criticized Donald Trump as the leader of the Republican Party. Not many Republicans were willing to say whether or not Trump was leading the Republican Party, despite recent polling indicating that he very much is leading the Republican Party. But you do have Republicans a little bit more reserved in who they say they're going to support for the Republican nomination, because we do have a pretty crowded field of candidates for the GOP nomination. But one thing was clear, that Republicans were critical of Biden. Everything from the swirl of pay to play and corruption that House Republicans are investigating of Biden, his age, his fitness. So clearly the top of the ticket is going to be a major issue heading into 2024.
We've got a lot to watch there, Greg, on the national level. Back to Illinois news. Tell us about this new law that allows punitive damages in wrongful death cases. What's the latest on this?
So this was an initiative really pushed by Democrats and the Illinois Trial Lawyers Association, and puts Illinois in with several other states that allow for punitive damages against a business, for instance, if indeed there is a wrongful death or if somebody is severely maimed. And this was sold as a bit of financial justice for victims and survivors of those who are killed in wrongful death cases. But the business community from day one opposed this, saying that it's jackpot justice or that it's going to be bad for business. In particular, you've got State Representative Dan Ugasti, who pushed back on this before it passed the legislature and the governor ultimately signed it. He said that it's understandable there needs to be some damages paid if somebody loses their life at the hand of a bad actor, but an entire business could go bankrupt if there are punitive damages and severe damages that are paid out. And Ugasti said that could lead to wide swaths of the economy having to lay off workers or go bankrupt. And he said that's not good for the economy. That's not good for those businesses, and that's not good for those jobs. So it's another measure that ultimately passed the Democrats-controlled legislature that Republicans and the business community pushed back on.
Now, Greg, do you know if this applies to the state? Like if the state is convicted or found to have done something, it caused a wrongful death, would the state have to pay punitive damages?
And and taxpayers ultimately would be the ones to pay that. And from my understanding, and don't quote me on this, but even though the recorder is going, if I recall, there were conversations about this in the Senate and the House chamber when they passed it. And from my recollection, it does not apply to the state.
Very interesting. Also, there's been a lot of news not out of Chicago, not just Mike Madigan, but Mayor Brandon Johnson. He proposed, or at least floated the idea of possibly sending the busloads of migrants that are coming into the city to the suburbs. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this is something that's obviously been an issue Chicago's been dealing with as a sanctuary city, and that's a city that is lax on enforcing federal immigration laws. And they've gotten around 12,000 or so undocumented migrants crossing the southern U.S. border being transported to Chicago in the past year. That's put a strain on their resources. And you see them being housed in police stations, and even the police union president saying that that's not making for safe conditions for the police officers in those stations. So you've got the police union even looking at possible OSHA violation allegations that they're going to try to push for. But Mayor Johnson, earlier this month, he actually said that he's in communications with not just cities in Cook County in the suburbs, but even beyond Cook County to possibly have these cities in the suburbs house some of these migrants and pick up on some of these costs. So clearly, there's a lot of questions and concerns about the resources that are needed here. And so far, state of Illinois and the city of Chicago's taxpayers have paid close to $100 million just in housing costs for these undocumented migrants, let alone the $550 million that the state has set aside for funding undocumented migrant health care for those who are over the age of 65. So this is a huge resource drain, but obviously these are humans. These are individuals who have been transported to Illinois because of its sanctuary state status, and it's going to be an interesting. It's going to be interesting to see exactly how Chicago manages this going forward, and how some suburban areas might have to deal with it as well.
That does bring up a lot of interesting questions for the suburbs. We'll have to see how that plays out. Greg, there's also some news this week about genderless bathrooms, multi-occupancy genderless bathrooms. Tell us the latest on this front.
So this was one of those hotly debated measures in the General Assembly whenever they passed it in spring session. The governor recently signed it, and it was part of what we call a late Friday bill dump, where the governor releases dozens of bills that he signed, and the genderless multi-occupancy restroom bill was one of those. Now, it's not a mandate, but it allows for businesses or places with public accommodation that have multi-stall, multi-occupancy restrooms to make them gender neutral. But they have to do a variety of things. Number one, they have to remove the urinals. So no urinals can be in this multi-occupancy gender neutral bathroom. But each stall, each toilet has to have floor to ceiling walls and a door, so that you have ultimate privacy going into the stall, going into a multi-gender, a gender-neutral multi-occupancy restroom. But some of the concerns were fathers who were members of the state legislature saying that they don't want their daughter going into a multi-occupancy restroom if there's going to be a man in there, and others pushing back on that idea, saying that that's a bigoted approach to this this issue. So it's one of those things where obviously there's a lot of difference of opinion. Regardless, the Democrats ultimately advanced the measure and the governor signed it.
That's certain. There's certainly a lot there, Greg. On to fraud, one of my favorite topics, the Paycheck Protection Program. There was some big news on this week, too. Tell us about what happened here.
So the Inspector General for state government looked into allegations of state employees committing Paycheck Protection Program fraud. And this was the program that used federal tax dollars to pay for legitimate businesses to cover payroll. And at first they were loans, and if the payroll was covered and they could prove it, then those loans were forgiven. But this money went out the door very quickly, and we're talking billions and billions and billions across the entire country. Now here we are 3 years later, and we're seeing all kinds of fraud. I think one estimate I saw was over all programs during COVID-19, there was like 17% of it was fraud. That's a huge number. That's more than decimating the program with fraud. But one thing we're finding out is there were several dozen state employees, even upwards to 37 at one particular facility, that were committing PPP fraud. And the Inspector General was looking into this, and ultimately there were 37 individuals let go from this one state institution. And Governor J.B. Pritzker said that fraud will never be tolerated, and anybody working for government will be held accountable if they commit fraud. And anybody not working in government, he said, will be held accountable when they commit fraud. Now, that's the PPP program, and it wasn't just in state government. You even had some in Cook County government found to have committed PPP fraud. But that's not also even considering the $5.2 billion of overpayment that came out of the unemployment system from over the COVID pandemic. And that's something that when I asked the governor a couple of weeks ago if there's going to be some accountability, the governor kind of brushed that off and said, we don't need to go back into the history books and open that back up. You know, there were some mistakes made and it was a rushed federal program. So it's interesting to hear the governor talk about holding people accountable for the fraud out of one program when they're found out. But when it comes to going after those who may have pushed the button to accept the unemployment fraud or the contractor who set up the program in Illinois for unemployment fraud, the governor didn't seem too apt to rush right in and work to hold people accountable there.
All right. And then there's some news on the firearms front as well this week, right, Greg?
Yeah, let me see if I can get this as quick as possible, because I know we're running out of time here with Illinois in Focus. And, of course, people can find more at thecentersquare.com. We've been tracking the issue with firearms and the gun ban. But also this past weekend on Saturday, just hours after the Illinois Supreme Court upheld the state's gun and magazine ban, Governor J.B. Pritzker signed a new law that allows for civil liability lawsuits against the firearms industry. Just days after the governor signed that on Saturday last week, the National Shooting Sports Foundation filed a lawsuit alleging Second Amendment violations, First Amendment violations, due process violations, interstate commerce violations. That case has now been assigned to the Southern District Federal Judge Stephen McGlynn, and McGlynn is the one who issued an injunction against the state's gun and magazine ban in the Southern District.
It's been a busy week. Thank you, Greg, for your insight into all these important stories, but that's all the time we have for this week. Listeners can keep up with these stories and more at thecentersquare.com. For Greg Bishop, I'm Brett Rowland. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe.